Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Teleos Ag Group today to take a deeper look into grafted watermelon production and management. This is a blog and video series that we have put together specifically looking at the watermelon production industry and agriculture, the challenges that face it, and potential solutions that we have as a group for farmers and those in the watermelon business. We are primarily looking at and trying to tackle the issues of reduced land availability, which results in shorter crop rotations, and that increases the instances of fusarium wilt, which is probably one of the larger yield limiting factors in watermelon production outside of environmental conditions. We see this issue all throughout the Southeast and the Mid-South and the greater watermelon production regions within what Teleos Ag Group covers. And we feel like we have good solutions for these issues and wanted to put together sort of a training document, if you will, or an informative series put together on what we have learned and what we are continuing to learn to help bring growers solutions for this problem. So we hope that you find this informative, and please reach out to us if you see anything here that you feel like you could implement to make your farm and operation more successful. And again, thanks for joining. So I will start by breaking down just quickly how Teleos Ag Group works. So Teleos Ag Group is rooted, its foundation is soil fumigation products and support, along with irrigation design and products. So soil fumigation and irrigation are our primary businesses. In this instance, Trihistal, who we are a partner with, is the supplier of grafted plants located in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and are supplying the plant material for all of the grafted work that we are doing in this, that will be highlighted in this series. Reddick Equipment Company supplies sprayer and plasticulture equipment, and it's a lot of the nuts and bolts of how we apply plasticulture and fumigation and irrigation. And then Liberty Acres Fertilizer, which is a plant nutrition and agronomic support spin of our business, mainly specializing in drip grade fertigation products. So essentially what we are is an all-inclusive support system and product supplier for specialty crop growers in the Southeast and Mid-South, Northeast regions of the United States. So why grafted? Why grafted plants? Why fumigation? So many of the things that we're going to talk about here. This is just a quick word chart, if you will, highlighting a lot of the issues and a lot of the inputs, a lot of the considerations that grow into watermelon production. Many of the words on this sheet right now are a lot higher than they were even when I initially made this presentation. But there's all of these things are things that farmers have to take into consideration that impact profitability. You know, shipping is a big one. Those costs are up. Harvest windows, the importance of hitting key dates, Memorial Day, 4th of July, as an example. What production system you're in, whether it be plasticulture or bare ground, what's your rotation, how far are you from packing sheds, what are your first frost-free dates, many things to consider in putting a crop in the ground and being profitable. And so our purpose again here is to talk about solutions to some of the major problems in watermelons and how they can be implemented on your farm. So I'll start by talking about the advantages of grafted plants. This image that you see on your right it's 5 sections of grafted plants in the center of a field with non-grafted plants of the same variety, same irrigation zone, same fertility, same everything, sandwiched on either side of those grafted plants. And it's not difficult to see just the vigor difference and just the striking plant health difference that there is in grafted plants versus non-grafted plants. And where that's coming from is an improved root system. So if you have a better pump, if you have a better engine, then it's not hard to make everything else better. That results in increased vigor, better plant and vine health. Another major component is disease resistance. So typically it's fusarium in all races. Depending on the rootstock you have, that varies some, but for the most part, the calling card of grafted plants is it is the solution for the fusarium problem. And this is something that is one of the major yield limiting factors in watermelons, and is becoming a critical component as rotations decrease and there's less land in which to farm watermelons. Nematode resistance is another big one. Root knot nematodes, primarily in the southeast, are our biggest yield limiting factor. This is rootstock dependent. I will touch on this in another slide. Reduce crop rotations. Because we can control the fusarium issue, you're able to reduce your crop rotations and grow the crop on less land or manage less land to grow your watermelon crop. And so this is becoming more and more and more of an important component into the production of watermelons. Field location and how far you are from packing or retail. You know, our farms are getting further and further from packing sheds. Freight is expensive. You're going further and further to find new land, and so this is becoming very costly. Prolonged harvest potential and higher yield potential. Because this plant is healthier, stays healthier longer, has disease resistance that keeps it healthy, we have a longer picking window and a higher yield potential overall, just because we have a stronger base. We have a larger plant in general in which to make higher yields. And the key is getting those yields in the right windows for your market, and a source of insurance within the overall production system. We say this because a lot of times in agriculture we view a change to the system as being across the board. You know, if we change it on 1 acre, we have to change it on all acres. And I think that we feel that grafted plants can certainly be used as a tool on a portion of your acres to reduce rotations or stay tight to packing facilities or heavy known fusarium ground. How can it be used as a source of insurance for the entire system? And the cost of production with grafted plants, whether fumigated or not, how can that be utilized across all of the melons that you put into the system, and be viewed as a way of ensuring the crop and knowing that you have more protective measures where you put those plants, depending on the amount of acres that you choose to do so. The major questions surrounding grafted plants that we get and that we set out to solve in this series and the research we've done and continue to do is which rootstock is best for your farm, ideal plant populations, fertility adjustments, fruit size, quality changes, variety selection. So these are all pretty common questions even within watermelon production in general, but when you have something as powerful as a grafted plant, a lot of these things change, and it's a system-wide approach. You know, I think one of the most common things we've seen watermelon growers do is take grafted plants, put them in a standard plant setting, keep everything the same, and not be successful. And there are certainly changes that have to be made to get maximum performance out of these plants. And then the two big ones are harvest window differences. So a 7 to 10 day delay is typical in a grafted plant. We'll talk about why that is more in another slide. But that is one issue, is that they are typically later, and because of that, you're later to market. And being later to market can have some pretty large financial repercussions and marketing repercussions. And then how do you make money? Grafted plants are more expensive. Yes, they give you more control, but at the end of the day, you have to see an economic return by making a change to something like this. So that is ultimately the question that we set out to answer. So in choosing which rootstock, really there are two primary options. One being Carolina Strongback, which is a citron-based rootstock. This is newer to the market since 2020, I believe, coming out of USDA and Clemson. The big thing that's different versus the hybrid squash rootstocks are root knot nematode resistance. That is something that's an issue with a squash-based stock, depending on how high your root knot nematode levels are. But that's something that solved one of the larger issues within the southeast in root knot nematode, and so it is a popular rootstock in that general area. And then fusarium resistance, or resistances across all races. And then interspecific hybrid squash, which is a squash-based rootstock. It is susceptible to root knot nematode, but fusarium resistance to all races. And this is probably one of the more wider distributed or widely grown rootstocks, Carolina Strongback being newer. But right now, in most of the Trieste regions in the southeast, it's primarily Carolina Strongback, and then as you start to head west into the mid-south, squash starts to pick up as a better rootstock. So in all of these questions that we had surrounding watermelon production and grafted and these problems that we set out to solve, we put together a trial in 2020. As you can see, this is a very busy image, but we wanted to look at as many factors as possible, get a feel for how these plants performed in a lot of different scenarios. I'll walk you through what all you're seeing here, but our point here was to rule out and or find common themes in which we could really focus on. And so this was the first trial that we put in place. And what you see here is these two blocks in between the yellow lines are different plant types. So everything in this block is Starbright, which is a seeded melon. Seeded melons aren't very popular within the marketing system right now. But they were plants we had available to us. And again, we were just looking for common trends. Then we go Joyride, which is a seedless melon. Mickey Lee was our pollinizer here. And then we go Starbright by Camel Force. This is the squash-based rootstock. Joyride by Camel Force, and then Starbright by Strongback, Joyride by Strongback. So we have two different varieties on two different rootstocks. Then within the red lines, these are all on 3-foot spacing. And so we're on 8-foot centers here, 8 foot from row to row, and then 3 foot in the drill or in the row, 4 foot, 5 foot. So we're looking at ideal plant populations here. On standard plants in this system, 3 foot is standard for this grower, but we did the same with grafted plants, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5. Then we're looking at this entire section right here, these 4 rows. We're looking at a 80% of the total fertility program. So we took the grower standard fertility program, which is pre-plant dry applied up front, and then everything else is fertigation multiple times weekly throughout the season. And we reduced everything by 20%. So dry rates up front, fertigation rates, we reduced everything from a grower standard by 20% in these 4 rows. These 4 rows, everything is 100% of the program. And then every other row is fumigated. This top row is fumigated, non-fumigated, fumigated, non-fumigated. So again, this is a very busy trial. It's a lot going on, but our purpose here was not statistical relevance. Our purpose here was to sense trends in the plants and decide what to really drill down on. It is of note that the fumigant use was 300 pounds of Pick 60 broadcast, which is popular in tomato or pepper production for this grower. This is how his rig was set up. This is what he had on farm, and we wanted to give it a look. So one thing that I will note just from this image here is 5 weeks after transplanting. And I want you to notice the vigor difference regardless of plant type. So these are standard plants in a fumigated row versus a non-fumigated row. You see the same effect here, fumigated vigor versus non-fumigated. As you go across the trial, you see that. This was pretty consistent, really caught our eye. Even when you go into the grafted plants who have more disease resistance, nematode resistance, particularly in strongback, versus the standard plants, which are over here, you see the same vigor effect. Here's a really good look at it. And so why is that? That was a major question that we had, is why are we seeing that vigor response? Why is that plant growing off better? The other thing that you'll notice here, and again, this is 5 weeks after transplanting, is this is an 80% reduction in fertilizer, these 4 rows versus these 4 rows. We got a lot going on, fumigated versus not, but just in general, if you look across all of the different treatments, pretty much the plants are performing the same in terms of color, in terms of growth. These fumigated plants look as good as these fumigated plants do. So we didn't see a lot of impact on the fertility side in the beginning, particularly in the grafted plants. So we were starting to see some of these trends that we were looking for. I'm going to jump to this slide just to take a look at end yield results. Again, these are on 5 plant plots. This is a lot of small work, but this was a trend that we saw. I pulled Joyride here. We saw similar things out of Starbright, but Joyride is more representative to most of the growers, or a seedless melon. This is a large seedless melon. Doesn't fit well into the 45 market that we have right now. However, it is a high yielding watermelon, very good one. This grower likes it, and for his purposes, but it is a seedless melon, and it's closer to yields that are going to be important on a variety or a system that most growers are using right now. So just for simplicity purposes, I'll leave Starbright out. But what you can see is this is 3-foot fumigated. This is blue bars are non-grafted standard plants. Orange bars are squash-based rootstock, and the gray bars are Carolina strongback. So what you can see here in most trials, trend, here's an exception, but for the most part, the best performing rootstock here was Carolina strongback. That's a trend. That's something we were looking for. It's something we could dive into. The other thing you can see is that fumigated, so this is 3-foot fumigated, 3-foot non-fumigated, regardless of standard plant or grafted plant, either rootstock, we get a big response to fumigation. Then we go to 4-foot, regardless of plant type, good response to fumigation. We go to 5-foot spacing, good response to fumigation. So regardless of plant type, grafted or not, whichever rootstock, we get a response to fumigation. That's another trend that we were looking for. You know, how do you get higher yields? Higher yields per acre is always something we're after. So that's something that we can clue in on. The other is if you look at Carolina strongback yields, which is what we wanted to focus here, fumigation, our highest yields were on 4-foot spacings, and we're fairly in line for the most part with 3-foot. So we knew that we could reduce from 3-foot to 4-foot. That's putting a lot less plants per acre. That's important for cost and efficiency purposes. And our yields drop pretty handedly when we go to 5-foot, simply too far. We need more melons per square foot than that. So ultimately, what we saw here was we wanted to look at Carolina strongback, fumigated versus not, on a plant population, around 1,200 plants per acre is what we gathered out of this real broad study. The other thing that we picked up from this, so this trial was set on June the 5th. So this image is on 6/30. So again, it's 25 days later. And so this is late set in central North Carolina. So this is a later planting. And again, the same image as before, these 4 beds have reduced fertilizer. And these 4 beds do not. These 4 beds are full rate for fertilizer. So we cut his dry by 20% and we cut some of his early fertigation events by 20% here. And we didn't see much difference. Call it between 3 and 4 weeks in. But when you go to 716, we're blooming, we're starting to set fruit here. Look at this trend that you start to see. These plants are starting to pale out. They're covering less plastic. They just don't have the vigor overall that we have right here. And so our full rate of fertilizers really picked back up. And so what we learned here, particularly on the grafted plants, is that we could reduce fertility inputs up front. We saw them bloom earlier where we did that. And we can make it on less fertility input early because we have a larger root system, and it wouldn't hurt us pre-bloom. But post-bloom, you have to go back to grower standard practices, or potentially even higher, depending on how high of a yield potential you have and how many fruit you have pulling from that system. But we saw you couldn't reduce it overall. So you couldn't just, because of that root system, you couldn't reduce fertility input season long and be really successful. You have to start pushing, but early you have options. Early, we saw benefit in pulling that fertility back up front, pre-bloom. So again, just building off of that, I use this image because this was in a trial of grafted plants versus standard plants. One of the first things I'll show you, you can start to see these standard plants thinning out or starting to go down to fusarium. Grafted plants are thick, lush, doing extremely well. The main thing from a fertility standpoint is you can see these yellow streaks going right down the crown of the plant. This is potassium deficiency that's starting, where a grower standard program was falling short due to the yields that were on these plants. This is a mini watermelon trial in this case, and so it was a really high yielding environment, but it is an example of where you may have to make some changes based on the amount of fruit load and what's pulling off of that plant. But as I said before, a larger root system does allow for reduced fertility pre-fruit set, and I stress pre-fruit set because once you start to set that fruit and you have a higher yield on the vine, you have to support it. So as I said before, if you reduce your fertility up front, it's an advantage, but if you reduce it across the board, that same study that we showed you just before, the slide before, that 20% fertility reduction across the life of the crop, fertigation, dry, everything, resulted in an 18% yield loss. So let's just say it's linear. As you reduce overall fertility input, you also reduce yield percent for percent, or at least in this case, that was the setting. Increased fruit set must be supported through fertility management, mainly nitrogen, potassium, calcium. Those are doing the heavy lifting for the most part within a watermelon crop, and you have to make sure you make adjustments based on the amount of yield that you are going to be supporting in this system. Earlier fertility reduction controls vine density and promotes earlier flowering. So most any watermelon grower understands that if you provide early season stress, that results in earlier bloom, and earlier bloom results in earlier set and earlier harvest. But it's always a balance. How much stress are you willing to apply to get early fruit while also getting the canopy you need and the overall fruit quality and overall yield that you want? And that can be a difficult notion in the Southeast, where we have heavier foliar disease issues. You can run into a lot of adverse weather conditions, and just overall you run the threat of holding the plant back earlier, having foliar diseases jump on you, and then not being able to build the canopy that you want to get total yields. But with grafted plants, the vigor component and just how vigorous they are overcomes that. And the bigger issue is pushing them too hard in the beginning and blowing them up, creating so much canopy that you start to get poor pollination and you delay flowering. And that's what we're trying to stay away from in the sense of grafted plants. And then my last bullet point is what I just described. Just balancing stress and overall yield potential is what you're after with a fertility program in grafted plants. So this is a more detailed look at what we're after when we're talking about that balance. Essentially, we're looking for an ideal node length of grafted between 4 and 5 inches. You can see my hand down here on a watermelon vine. That's what we're looking for. If you're 2 to 3 inches, call it 2 to 3 fingers before, you're probably stressing them too much. You're holding back too much water. You're holding back too much fertilizer. If you're out 7, 8 inches, then they're growing too fast. You're going to have way too much canopy. So we almost use this internode spacing as a fuel gauge in whether to speed up or slow down in the management of the plants. The ideal setting that we have found is to reduce upfront and lower your soil moisture. So reduce your pre-plant in by 20 to 30%. This is soil type dependent, variety dependent. Please reach out to us if you're interested in having this discussion, and we can talk about that in a more specific manner. And also lower your soil moisture. Run soil moistures between 30 and 40%. Run beds on the drier side. So we're not trying to kill plants, but we are trying to put some pressure on them. And then begin your standard fertigation once female blooms are set. So once that plant has changed gears, it has bloomed, it's in a reproductive state, then put your foot on the gas, because we know what that overall 20% reduction looks like. What we've seen is that standard plants will set crown fruit on nodes 4 to 8. And so we're calling a node a leaf. So 4 to 8 leaves out, you'll get your first fruit. On grafted, it's 8 to 12, even under this management. There is a delay there that exists with grafted. It is even when we're doing fertility management, you are going to see fruit set further out on the vine. But through management, you can make it much better than it typically would be put in a standard production system. So plant populations you saw from the earlier trial that we ran, where we went from 3 foot to 4 foot. Ideal plant population reductions are 20 to 30%, because you have so much more vine coverage, you have so much more mass and vigor within the plant that you can do more with less plants. And so if you do not reduce plant populations, in almost all scenarios where we've seen that be the case, where you come in at standard plant populations, it's just, knee to thigh high vines, you have just way too much foliage, blooms get tucked down, you get poor pollination because pollinators can't find them, or just won't work that hard to get down to them. It causes hollow heart issues and delays fruit set. And so managing that vine is key. Typically what we see is you retain your standard row spacing. So whether you're on 6 foot centers, 8 foot centers, 9, 10, 12, whatever your row centers are, you generally maintain that, and then you will increase the distance between plants in the drill. I will say that as we continue to do this, wider row spacings are a target of research, because that decreases overall your what we would call broadcast equivalent rate. So whether it's fumigant, drip tape, plastic, the linear feet in a row decreases, so does your cost or overall input on that acre. So there is a trend or some interest in going wider and then increasing in row spacings. But regardless, you're decreasing the amount of square footage per plant, and you are ultimately putting less plants per acre. This is a pretty good example of the way fruit sets when we decrease plant populations in watermelons. So this is basically this is a trial in minis here. So it's a little higher plant set than what you would see on standard melons. But this is a 5 plant example. This is 6 weeks after transplanting. And so we went in on grower standard and we pulled up 5 plants. We stripped all the fruit off. You can see the fruit is heavier weighted to the crown, and you can see the maturity gap here. Not not way far, but there is a maturity gap here, and it's heavier set to the crown. You have a small amount of melons in this intermediary window in second position, and then in third position you got a lot of fruit. How much of this fruit will make, how much of this fruit shucks off is going to have a lot to do with fertility practices, weather conditions, overall plant health. But you can already see just from the quality of some of this fruit, you know, this is far from safe. When we go to grafted plant on a 30% plant reduction, so this is standard plant, standard population. This is grafted plants and reduction. We're heavier weighted to the vine, heavier weighted in this second position, less on the crown. This is typical of what we see, but an overall higher set. And so your management really starts to focus on retaining that fruit. From fumigation, as you saw in the yield results that I put up earlier, increased yields, we're seeing increased yields in both standard and grafted plants where we put fumigation in the system, where we're fumigating. And you know, it's typically between 8 and 12% bumps in yields due to fumigation. But we'll get into a lot of those studies and a lot of that further information in the next blog series. We're kind of setting the foundation here. But in this study, kind of this introductory study, we saw those yields come up pretty handedly where we fumigated versus where we didn't. And again, it was regardless of standard plants, regardless of grafted plants. The question though is, why are we seeing increased yields in a grafted plant where we're controlling fusarium and nematodes? So in a standard plant where you don't have those protections, obviously in a fumigation setting, if we're suppressing soil-borne diseases, we're suppressing nematodes, it makes sense why we would be seeing yield increases. But we were pretty surprised to see these yield increases behind grafted plants. And so that'll be another major topic of this discussion as we move forward, is why are we seeing that? We had a great vigor response to fumigation. As you remember from those drone images, the fumigated rows, the plants were growing off faster and better than non-fumigated. So yet again, if it's not a disease holding those non-fumigated plants back, then why is a fumigated plant growing better? Because it clearly is. We're seeing this effect, and it's very common to see this effect in fumigated land. Also in this trial, we were at a full rate of chloropicrin and TELONE. We were at 300 pounds broadcast. So full rate is relative depending on where you are in the country. But for this grower on tomatoes, that's his rate. And so that would be 150 pounds in row, or broadcast equivalent in row rate or applied rate. So we wanted to look at different fumigation strategies, more cost-effective strategies, when we know that we have the control of a grafted plant in place, helping control fusarium and nematodes. How do we get that vigor response, and how do we get that yield response at the best economic return? We didn't feel that this full rate of fumigation was needed to achieve what we saw, this vigor response, but that will be in the next episode of this as we continue this conversation and we walk you through our years of research in dialing in what our current production practices are, what our current recommendations are. But I'm kind of taking you through the timeline of how we started to solve these issues. So talking about harvest windows, as I said earlier, grafted plants typically have a 7 to 10 day delay in maturity. And this image, this is Starbright, so that is a seeded melon. No, it's uncommon to see seeded melons, but this was a variety this grower wanted to grow. But in general, what you see in that image, what you see in that top image was a fumigated melon under fertility reduction. And what you see in the bottom is a non-fumigated grafted melon that was also under fertility reduction. So we started to see some maturity differences where we were fumigating and doing fertility reduction versus where we weren't fumigating. And that kind of piqued our interest because that delay is a big deal. If you're trying to hit Memorial Day in South Florida, or you're trying to hit 4th of July in Georgia, or the Carolinas, those are big windows in which you're trying to make watermelons. And so why do we see that delay? Well, the physical act of grafting, of cutting the plant and injuring the plant, causes hormone responses, and there's also a healing process. I mean, it's no different than if you or I broke our arm. It's gonna be a while before you start throwing the football. So it's a similar scenario where this plant has to overcome that. And there's stress hormones. There's a lot of different things happening within that plant, but in general, it's very consistent that we see this delay. Um, what we are seeing though is that reduced inputs, so water and fertilizer pre-bloom, and fumigation, those combinations are resulting in earlier maturity. We saw it in this study, and it became a key topic of discussion in one of the key research protocols and things we were trying to determine in future studies, again, which we'll start to cover more in depth in the next series. But we saw that effect in this study, and that's really something we wanted to drill down on. And then finally, all grafted plants are not created equal. You know, if that physical act of grafting is what is resulting in that maturity delay, then how good you are at grafting, how good you are at healing that plant on the back side of that, and just how you prepare your plants for being put in the field also has a lot to do with that. So I guess, yeah, there's no really better way to say it than all grafted plants aren't created equal. You can't assume that grafted plants from one source are going to act exactly the same as grafted plants from another source. Fruit size and quality in these studies, basically we saw no major difference in bricks where we fumigated versus where we didn't, grafted versus non-grafted. All of this work was on Carolina Strongback, and we saw no hollow heart issues. We saw no flesh density issues, being too high or too low. I mean, pretty much everything we saw, fruit quality was on par with what a grower standard was. So fumigation or grafted, it didn't make any higher sugar content, didn't make any lower. Everything was pretty level. Um, One thing we did see is grafted plants can result in slightly larger fruit. It depends on, it's very variety dependent, plant population dependent, weather, irrigation practices. There's a lot of nuance in fertility practices. So there's a lot of moving parts in that. But for the most part, pound for pound, we saw it produce slightly larger fruit and more consistent fruit size. We didn't see as much variation between crop throw of 36s, 45s, and 60s. And so we knew that and wanted to use that and build off of that as we move forward. So just a summary, this image that's on the right, those are grafted plants of the same variety, same management on the left versus standard plants of the same variety, same management on the right. And so obviously there's value in what you see there. There's a value in building bigger, better plants and higher yields. It's just how do you take advantage of it? How do you put an overall program together that makes that system financially viable? And so in closing, our grafted plants should be viewed as a tool for additional control in a very complex system. We kind of touched the tip of the iceberg in this discussion, but we laid out a lot of the things that you have to consider. And it is not as simple as you plug a grafted plant in and it solves all your problems. It's a much deeper consideration than that. Grafted plants can be a source of insurance that you can count on in adverse conditions, whether those adverse conditions are fusarium, shorter rotations, just heavily farmed land, whatever the case may be, or nematode-ridden land. They're a stronger, better plant that can handle a lot more roadblocks. And so how do you use that? How many roadblocks are in your system? from farm to farm, that's going to be a different conversation. But overall, it is a tool that can be used effectively to overcome problems. It provides a higher yield potential and extended harvest windows under correct management. So we have a plant that stays healthier longer. We can get more picks off of it. We can pick it longer. And because of that, it provides a higher yield potential. It just overall, it's a stronger plant. But we know the importance of early fruit. We know the importance of early yield. And so it really just depends on your operation. But in general, it sets a higher platform for higher yields. And lastly is fumigation and fertility adjustments allow for even higher yields than just a grafted plant alone and shorter maturity gaps. The combination of those two it is resulting in we're having tighter maturity gaps as low as we feel like we can get it down to an average of 5 days from an average of 10 days. And we can get those yields up as you saw briefly in these results. So we will expand on this as we move forward in the next web series, in the next video like this, where we took what we learned here in 2020 and these trends, and then we put it into larger scale trials where we're focusing on lower rates of chloropicrin fumigation to get this vigor response and this yield. We settle in on one plant population, one variety, and we really start to dial in on the fertility aspects, and we're really looking hard at this maturity window. We also start to take a look at non-grafted pollinizers. So in the grafted plants in these studies, the pollinizers were grafted. You can also reduce cross by looking at non-grafted pollinizers, but a lot of things to consider there as well in yield and quality of the crop. And so we just start to take the next step from what we learned here. But we've gotten really good responses. We hope that you stick with us and join us next time as we continue to have this conversation. Hopefully you found this information useful. And again, if we at Triest Ag Group can help you at all in watermelon production or agricultural production of any kind, please feel free to reach out, and we appreciate your time.